It was Christmas night and the storm warnings were already rolling across the radio screen when I did the thing I would later wish I could erase. I sat inside my car with the heat turned all the way up, watching people line up outside the church, warming center beneath the building I owned, while snow clung to their coats and shoulders. The glass tower behind me reflected my face back at me pale and still, while the rest of the city rushed home to warmth and light. Earlier that evening, I had ordered the security guard to clear the sidewalk because donors were arriving and I did not want the crowd near the entrance. One of the volunteers wearing a red scarf tried to explain that the temperature was dropping fast and the buses were already delayed, but I cut him off and told him to move the line away from the front. He looked at me the way people do when they realize exactly who you are. Not impressed, just disappointed. I told myself it was business and nothing personal, and that was the lie I carried with me as I sat there watching the snow fall harder. The radio crackled again, warning that the storm had accelerated and that bus routes were being suspended immediately. The warming center would close early for safety. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and reached for the gear shift, ready to leave before anyone noticed me sitting there doing nothing. That was when I heard the small voice cut through the wind. It was calm and tired and far too steady for a child standing in the cold. A little boy stood in line ahead of his mother, clutching a paper cup with both hands as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the ground. He could not have been older than 7. He turned back toward her and said, "Mom said Santa forgot us again." No one laughed. No one corrected him. The words hovered in the air like breath that refused to disappear. I felt something twist in my chest, sharp and unexpected, and I hated myself for feeling it. I told myself I was imagining things and stared straight ahead as if the windshield held answers it never had. The boy shuffled his feet to keep warm, and his mother pulled her coat tighter around him even though it was too thin to do much good. I could see her hands shaking from where I sat. The radio continued listing closures and warnings, and every alert sounded like an excuse to leave. I turned the key slightly, and the engine responded obediently, as if waiting for my permission to disappear. That was when the boy spoke again, this time softer, as if he were sharing a secret with the night itself. He said, "It is okay, though, because Mom says sometimes Santa just comes late." Something in that sentence cracked open a place I had sealed years ago. I do not know how long I sat there with the engine running and the heat blowing while the snow began to blur the world outside my window. I knew what I should do. I should drive away and go home to a place that was warm and empty and familiar. I should let someone else handle the mess outside because that was what I always did. Instead, my hand fell away from the gear shift and rested uselessly in my lap. I watched the line shuffle forward and saw the volunteer in the red scarf glance toward me and then away. I imagined how this scene must look from the outside. A rich man in a warm car watching people freeze while waiting for soup. The thought made my stomach turn. I shut off the engine and the sudden silence felt louder than the storm. For a moment, I stayed exactly where I was, breathing slowly, as if waiting for the world to give me permission to do something different. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit my face like a slap, and snow soaked through my shoes almost instantly. I closed the door behind me and walked toward the line, feeling every eye turn in my direction even if they did not. I took my place directly behind the woman and the boy and said nothing at all. The boy looked up at me with open curiosity and asked simply, "Are you cold too?" I did not answer because in that moment I was colder than I had been in years. The boy did not wait for my answer, and that somehow made it worse. He simply nodded as if my silence were enough and turned back toward the table where volunteers were pouring soup from a large metal pot. Snow crept down the back of my collar, and for the first time I felt how sharp the air really was. The woman beside him noticed me then and instinctively shifted her body so she stood slightly between us. It was subtle but practiced, and I understood immediately that this was a mother who had learned how to measure people in seconds. She gave me a quick, polite glance and then focused on her son, pulling his hood up higher and rubbing his hands together. He leaned into her side and said quietly that his fingers hurt. She whispered that it would be warm soon and kissed the top of his hat. Watching that small exchange stirred something I had not felt in years, and I hated how quickly it reached me. The line moved forward, and when it was our turn, a volunteer handed each of us a cup and wished us a Merry Christmas with the kind of cheer that sounds braver than it feels. The boy thanked him too loudly and then turned to me again as if we were already sharing something. He asked if I always stood in lines like this or if tonight was special. I told him no and then realized that was not entirely true. He squinted up at me, studying my face with an intensity that felt unfair. He said, "You do not look like the other people here," and then quickly added that it was not a bad thing. His mother apologized immediately, saying he talked too much when he was tired, but I shook my head and told her it was fine. The truth was, his voice anchored me to the moment in a way I had not expected. He introduced himself as Lucas and said he was 7.5 because half mattered. He asked my name, and I hesitated before telling him Ethan. Saying it out loud felt strange, like handing over something I usually kept protected. He repeated it carefully as if committing it to memory, and then asked if I had kids. The question landed harder than the cold, and I felt my throat tighten. I told him not anymore, and he frowned, trying to understand what that meant. His mother glanced at me sharply, then softened when she saw my expression. She told him to drink his soup before it got cold, and he obeyed for exactly 3 seconds before asking why I was standing there if I had a car. I realized then that he must have noticed it earlier, and I wondered what else he saw that others missed. I told him sometimes people stand in lines even when they do not have to. He nodded thoughtfully and said his mom said that too. The storm picked up again, and snow whipped sideways across the sidewalk. The volunteer in the red scarf announced that they would be closing in 10 minutes, and anyone still waiting would need to find shelter elsewhere. I felt a ripple of panic move through the line and saw the woman beside me glance down at her son, then back up at the sky. She thanked the volunteer and stepped aside, holding Lucas close. I heard her whisper that they would figure it out. Lucas looked at me again and asked where I was going next. I opened my mouth and realized I had no answer ready. I told him home, and he nodded but did not look convinced. He said I should hurry because it was getting bad, and then asked if my home was warm. I said yes, and he smiled faintly and said that was good. His mother finally spoke directly to me, then thanking me for standing back there without complaint. I told her it was nothing, but she shook her head and said it was something. Her name was Rachel, and she said it quickly as if not wanting it to linger. She asked Lucas to put his cup down and pulled out a pair of gloves from her bag, sliding them onto his hands with care. I noticed they were mismatched and worn thin at the fingers. The radio from my car cut through the noise with another warning about closures and roads shutting down, and I saw her flinch at the sound. Lucas tugged at her sleeve and asked where they were going now. She told him they would find somewhere warm and smiled too quickly. He turned to me and asked if I was going to the same place as them. I felt the weight of the question and the choice inside it. I looked at Rachel and saw the calculation in her eyes, the way she was already deciding what kind of man I might be. I told her there was a lobby nearby with heat and security and cameras, and that she did not have to answer right away. I said it carefully, making sure every word left space for her to say no. She looked down at Lucas, who was watching her with quiet trust, and then back at me. Before she could answer, Lucas spoke again and said it was nice talking to me and that I seemed lonely. I laughed once out of surprise and asked what made him think that. He shrugged and said, "You stand like someone waiting for something." The storm howled around us, and for the first time I realized I was no longer pretending to be unaffected. The storm no longer sounded distant now, and the wind wrapped around the building like it was trying to tear something loose. Snow scraped across the sidewalk and stung my face when I turned toward Lucas again. He was watching me with the same calm focus he had shown all night, as if adults were puzzles he had learned to solve by listening more than speaking. Rachel tightened her grip on his shoulders, sensing the shift in the air, and glanced toward the street where headlights were already disappearing under the thickening white. I told myself I should step back and let them go their way, but my feet stayed planted. Lucas took another small sip of soup, then looked up at me and asked the question I felt coming before the words even formed. He asked why I looked sad if I had everything. The simplicity of it knocked the breath out of me more effectively than the cold ever could. I opened my mouth to respond with something safe, something practiced, something that would end the conversation, but nothing came. The truth hovered just behind my teeth, heavy and unwelcome. I had spent years mastering silence in rooms full of people, but standing there in the snow with a child waiting for an honest answer stripped that skill away. Rachel shifted again, her eyes flicking between us, clearly ready to pull him closer if I said something wrong. I swallowed and looked past them at the street, trying to buy myself time. The radio from my car burst through the wind again, announcing that the warming center was officially closing and that anyone remaining should seek immediate shelter. A volunteer repeated the message louder this time, and the remaining line began to scatter in different directions. Rachel exhaled slowly, the sound tight and controlled. She whispered to Lucas that they needed to move. He nodded but did not take his eyes off me. I realized then that my silence had become its own answer. I finally spoke and told him that sometimes having things did not mean you knew where you belonged. It was not the truth, but it was close enough to hurt. He considered that carefully, then asked if I belonged anywhere tonight. The question landed harder than the first. Rachel apologized again and said he had no filter when he was cold, but I shook my head. I told her it was okay and that he was asking the right questions. The wind picked up and Lucas shivered despite the gloves. Rachel pulled him close and said they needed to find somewhere warm fast. She glanced toward the street and then back at me, and for the first time there was a flicker of fear she did not bother hiding. She said quietly that they did not have anywhere warm to go. The words were not dramatic or pleading. They were factual, and that made them worse. I felt the weight of them settle in my chest and stay there. I thought of my car idling nearby my empty apartment a few blocks away and the lobby downstairs with its marble floors and silent security desk. I thought of how easy it would be to walk away and how impossible it suddenly felt. Lucas squeezed his mother's hand and told her it was okay because they had done this before. He said it like a statement, not a complaint, and that hurt more than anything else he had said. Rachel smiled at him the way people do when they want to keep a child from seeing what they already know. She looked at me again and asked where I was headed. I told her the truth this time and said I lived nearby and that there was a lobby with heat and lights and people around. I made sure to add that there were cameras and guards and that she could leave at any time. I heard myself talking too much and forced myself to stop. She studied me carefully, measuring my posture, my tone, my distance. Lucas leaned closer to her and whispered something I could not hear. She listened, then sighed and nodded once. She told me they would walk together and that if anything felt wrong, they would leave immediately. I told her that was fair and meant it. We started down the sidewalk together, the snow crunching under our shoes and the city fading into a blur of white and sound. Lucas walked between us, swinging his arms and talking about how snowstorms made the world feel smaller. He asked if I liked Christmas, and I told him I was not sure anymore. He said that was okay because some people liked it later. As we reached the corner near my building, he stopped and looked up at me again. He asked one more question quietly this time. He asked if I missed the person who made me sad. I did not answer him then either, but for the first time, I did not look away. We did not rush, even though the storm urged us to. I walked half a step ahead so Rachel could see exactly where we were going, and so Lucas would stay between us without feeling pulled. The sidewalk lights blurred under the falling snow, and the city felt smaller and quieter with every block. I told Rachel again that we did not have to go anywhere she did not want, and that the lobby was open all night with a security desk and cameras at every entrance. I said it slowly and clearly because I wanted her to hear what mattered and ignore the rest. She nodded once and said she appreciated that I did not push. When we reached the building, the revolving door groaned as it turned, and warm air wrapped around us like a held breath finally released. Lucas stopped just inside and lifted his face toward the ceiling lights. He closed his eyes for a second and smiled in a way that felt almost painful to watch. Rachel did not relax, though, not yet. She scanned the space first to the guard behind the desk, the cameras mounted near the elevators, the wide-open floor that offered nowhere to hide. Only then did she let Lucas step fully inside. I kept my distance and stood where the guard could see all of us clearly. I introduced myself to him by name and told him they would be with me for a bit to warm up. The guard nodded politely and wished us a Merry Christmas without a hint of curiosity. That seemed to ease something in Rachel because her shoulders dropped just slightly. Lucas took off his gloves and rubbed his hands together, marveling at how quickly the feeling came back. He said it smelled clean and empty at the same time. Rachel apologized for the snow on the floor, and I told her it was fine and meant it. We sat on opposite ends of a long bench, and Lucas perched between us, swinging his legs. He asked if people lived here, and I told him yes, but not many stayed during holidays. He asked if that made it lonely, and I did not answer right away. Rachel thanked me quietly and said they would only stay a few minutes. I told her she could stay as long as she needed and that there was coffee by the desk if she wanted some. She hesitated, then asked if it was okay to use the restroom first. I showed her where it was and stayed seated with Lucas while she went. He leaned back against the bench and sighed dramatically, then looked up at me and said this place felt warm but lonely. I asked him what made him say that, and he shrugged and said there were no voices echoing. When Rachel returned, she looked more composed, but her eyes were tired. I asked if they had somewhere else lined up, and she shook her head. She said the buses were done and the diner they sometimes used closed early because of the storm. She said it without asking for anything, and that mattered to me. I told her there was an empty apartment upstairs that belonged to the building and that security knew about it and that it had heat and blankets. I was careful to say she could say no and that we could stay right where we were. She did not answer immediately. She looked at Lucas, then at the elevators, then back at me. She asked who else would know, and I told her the guard and building management. She asked if the door locked from the inside, and I said yes. She asked if she could leave whenever she wanted, and I said of course. Lucas tugged at her sleeve and whispered that his feet were wet. She took a deep breath and nodded once. She said okay, but only until the storm eased. I told her that was more than fair. The elevator ride was quiet, and I stood near the panel so they had space. When the doors opened, the apartment was exactly as I remembered, it clean furnished and untouched. Rachel checked the thermostat and turned it up slightly. Lucas wandered in slow circles, touching the couch, the table, the window. He said it looked like no one lived here. I told him that was true. He asked if that made me sad, and I felt the question settle in my chest again. Rachel set their bags down and thanked me one more time. I told her she did not owe me anything. She looked at me then and said this was the only kind of offer she could accept. The apartment warmed quickly, and with it came an awkward quiet that pressed against the walls. Rachel stood near the door as if she might need to leave at any moment while Lucas drifted from room to room, taking everything in with careful curiosity. He stopped at the window and watched the snow race sideways past the glass and said it looked like the sky was in a hurry. I told him it was, and he nodded as if that explained everything. I offered Rachel a towel for Lucas's wet shoes, and she thanked me but did not sit down. I realized then how used she was to staying ready. I told her there was food in the kitchen, simple things, soup crackers, bread, and she hesitated before nodding. While she helped Lucas change his socks, I stood there unsure of what to do with my hands or my presence. I felt like an intruder in my own space, and that made no sense because I owned it. That was when I reached for the one solution I had relied on for most of my adult life. I pulled my wallet from my coat and slid out a few bills, more than enough to cover a night somewhere warm and safe. I held them out quietly and told her she could use them however she needed. The room went very still. Rachel looked at the money, then at my face, and for a moment I thought she might take it. Instead, she closed my hand around it gently and shook her head. She said thank you, but no, and the way she said it carried no anger, only resolve. She told me she did not want Lucas to think that help only came in the shape of cash handed down from someone else. She said she wanted him to believe people helped because they chose to, not because they could afford to. The words landed with a weight I was not prepared for. I felt my face flush with something close to shame, and I put the wallet away without another word. Lucas watched the exchange quietly and then asked if that meant we were still okay. Rachel smiled at him and said yes, of course, and that sometimes grown-ups just talked in strange ways. He accepted that and returned to the window where he pressed his nose to the glass and drew a line through the fog. I apologized then and meant it. Rachel waved it off and said she understood why I had offered. She said people like me were used to fixing things quickly. I did not deny it. She asked if there was paper and something to draw with because Lucas liked to keep busy when he was nervous. I found a pad and a pen in a drawer and handed them over. Lucas took them with excitement and sat cross-legged on the floor. He asked if he could draw Santa, and I told him he could draw whatever he wanted. He nodded seriously and began to work his tongue, peeking out slightly as he concentrated. Rachel finally sat on the edge of the couch and let out a slow breath as if she had been holding it all night. She thanked me again and said this was already more than enough. I told her I was glad they were here and surprised myself by how true it felt. Lucas held up the drawing a few minutes later and asked if I thought Santa would recognize it. I told him Santa would know exactly what it was meant to be. He smiled and added another line to the page. He asked if Santa ever forgot adults too, and I hesitated before answering. I said sometimes Santa remembered them later. He seemed satisfied with that and went back to drawing. Rachel watched him with an expression that held both love and exhaustion. She said quietly that nights like this were hard, but they managed. I asked how long they had been on their own, and she shrugged and said long enough. I did not push. The storm continued outside, relentless and loud, but inside the apartment the quiet felt different now, less sharp. Lucas finished his drawing and placed it carefully beside him. He asked if he could make one more thing. I asked what he had in mind, and he said he wanted to write Santa a note to remind him about people who waited. I told him that sounded important. As he bent over the paper again, Rachel looked at me and said this was the first place Lucas had felt safe all night. I nodded and felt something in my chest shift again, this time slower, deeper. I realized then that the mistake I had made was not offering money, but believing it was the only language I spoke. The apartment had always been a place I avoided even though it belonged to me. It existed between use and neglect, furnished enough to be habitable, yet stripped of anything personal as if I had intended to pass through, and never did. Lucas moved slowly across the room, tracing the edges of things with his eyes, while Rachel folded their coats and set them neatly by the door. I watched her movements careful and efficient, and realized she treated every borrowed space the same way, leaving no sign they had been there longer than necessary. I told her she could put their things wherever she wanted, and she nodded, but did not change what she was doing. Lucas asked if anyone lived here, and I told him not anymore. He tilted his head and asked why someone would leave a place like this. I said sometimes people stop wanting to be reminded of who they were. He considered that, then asked if the reminders were loud. I smiled, despite myself, and said sometimes they were. He wandered toward a low cabinet near the wall and tugged on the handle before looking back at me for permission. I nodded and he opened it carefully. Inside were boxes stacked without order, some labeled, some not all untouched for years. He pulled one out and sneezed when dust puffed into the air. Rachel started to say something but stopped herself. Lucas wiped his nose and asked what was inside. I told him old things, and he said old things were interesting because they remembered you even when you forgot them. He reached inside and pulled out a strand of lights, tangled and dull. He asked if they still worked, and I told him I did not know because I had not tried. He looked at me like that was the strangest thing he had heard all night. He said you should try because sometimes things surprise you. Rachel watched from the couch, her expression unreadable. I plugged the lights into an outlet, and after a moment a few bulbs flickered weakly, then steadied into a soft, uneven glow. Lucas clapped once, then covered his mouth as if remembering where he was. He asked if it was Christmas lights, and I nodded. He said they made the room feel less quiet. Rachel stood then and came closer, her eyes resting on the boxes. She asked gently if it was okay to open one more. I hesitated, then nodded again. She chose a smaller box and lifted the lid. Inside were ornaments wrapped in tissue, some cracked, some faded, all unmistakably loved once. Lucas picked one up carefully, a small wooden star with a name written on the back in blue marker. He turned it over and read the name slowly, then looked up at me. He asked who Noah was. The name hit me like a hand to the chest, and I felt the room tilt slightly. I told him he was my son. Lucas did not react the way adults usually did. He did not apologize or look away. He simply nodded as if that information fit into a picture he was already building. He asked where Noah was now. I told him he was not here anymore. Rachel stepped closer then and placed a hand lightly on Lucas's shoulder. He thought for a moment, then asked if Noah liked Christmas. I told him he loved it more than anyone. Lucas smiled and said that made sense. He set the ornament back gently and asked if he could put the light somewhere. I said yes and watched as he arranged them around the window frame, uneven and imperfect. When he stepped back, he asked if it was okay, even though it was crooked. I told him it was perfect. Rachel looked at me then, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not trust exactly, but something softer. She said this place did not feel empty anymore. I did not respond because my throat had closed. Lucas sat on the floor again and returned to his drawing, adding the lights to the picture with small, careful strokes. He hummed quietly a tune I almost recognized but could not place. I realized then that no one had been inside this apartment for years, not really, and that I had kept it hidden because I did not want anyone to see how untouched my life had become. Lucas looked up and asked if Noah ever came back here. I shook my head and said no. He nodded, then asked if Noah would like it now. I said I thought he would. Rachel suggested making some tea, and I agreed, grateful for the normalcy of it. As the kettle warmed, Lucas held up his drawing and asked if he could keep it here for a while, so Santa could see it if he came by. I told him Santa would see it anywhere. He smiled and placed it carefully on the table anyway. In that moment, I understood that this apartment had never been empty because it lacked people. It was empty because I had refused to let anyone witness the life that had stopped inside it. The kettle clicked off with a dull sound that seemed too loud for the room, and Rachel moved to pour the water as if giving us all something to do might keep the air from thickening. Lucas stayed near the table where the drawing lay and traced the lights he had added with his finger, humming softly under his breath. The ornament with Noah's name rested back inside the box, but the name itself did not go back with it. It lingered in the space between us, heavier than the steam rising from the mugs. I had not said his name out loud in years, not even to myself, 'cause saying it made everything real again. Lucas broke the silence without realizing it needed breaking. He asked if Noah was older or younger than him. I told him older, and his eyes widened with quiet admiration. He said that meant Noah probably knew a lot of things, and I nodded even though my chest tightened. Rachel handed me a mug, and our fingers brushed briefly before she pulled away. She thanked me for the tea and then said softly that Lucas had a cousin named Noah once. The coincidence felt sharp and unnecessary, but she said it gently, as if offering a bridge, not a wound. Lucas looked between us and asked if that was why the apartment felt sad at first. I took a breath and decided not to hide behind silence this time. I told him it felt sad because I had not let myself remember in a long time. He considered that carefully, then asked if remembering hurt more than forgetting. I told him sometimes it did, but that forgetting made things heavier in a different way. He nodded as if that answered something important. Rachel watched me closely then and said she appreciated my honesty. I told her I did not have much practice with it. Lucas asked what Noah liked to draw, and I smiled faintly and said trains and dogs and anything with too many wheels. He laughed and said that sounded like a good taste. He reached for another piece of paper and began drawing something new without asking. I watched his small hand move quickly, confident and unafraid of mistakes. Rachel sat back on the couch and wrapped her hands around her mug. She asked quietly how long it had been. I told her 5 years. She did not say she was sorry, and I was grateful for that. She said 5 years was a long time to carry something alone. I shrugged and said it became normal. Lucas looked up again and asked if Noah had ever been here on Christmas. The question landed gently but firmly. I told him yes, and that he used to wake me before sunrise. Lucas smiled and said that was rude, but also nice. He asked what happened on the last Christmas. I hesitated, feeling the old instinct to retreat, but something about the way he asked felt different. I told him I had been busy and that I missed it. I did not say more. He nodded and returned to his drawing. Rachel met my eyes, and there was understanding there, not curiosity. The storm outside battered the windows, and for a moment the sound matched the weight in my chest. Lucas held up the new drawing and showed me a small figure standing beside a taller one, both holding lights. He asked if that looked right. I told him it did. He added a third figure, then paused and asked if it was okay. I said yes. He asked who it should be, and I surprised myself by saying my name. He smiled and wrote it carefully beneath the figure, then wrote Noah beside the other. He looked up at me and said, now they were together. The simplicity of it broke something open, and I turned away, pretending to study the lights by the window. Rachel spoke softly then and said she needed to put Lucas to rest for a bit. I nodded and showed her where the bedroom was. As they disappeared down the hall, I stood alone in the living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life I had not shared. I picked up the ornament again and traced the faded letters with my thumb. Saying the name in my head was not enough anymore. When Rachel returned, Lucas was already half asleep, leaning against her shoulder. She thanked me again and said he would rest better knowing someone was listening. I told her I was glad. She hesitated, then asked if I was okay. I looked at the ornament and finally said the name out loud, quietly but clearly. I said Noah. The sound of it settled into the room and stayed there. It hurt and it helped all at once. Lucas woke before dawn, even though the storm still pressed against the windows and the apartment hummed with the quiet of borrowed sleep. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes and listening as if the room itself were breathing. Rachel whispered for him to lie back down, but he shook his head and said he heard music. I told him there was none playing, and he smiled and said it was the kind you remember. He slipped from the bed and padded into the living room, carrying his drawing like a map. Rachel followed at a distance, giving him space and giving me a look that asked permission without words. Lucas stood near the window where the lights glowed uneven and began to hum. The melody crept into me slowly, and I recognized it before I wanted to. It was a carol Noah used to sing in the car on the way to school, off-key and fearless. Lucas did not know the words, so he made his own, and the innocence of it split me open. My breath caught and my knees weakened, and I sat down hard on the couch. Rachel froze, watching me as if deciding whether to intervene or let the moment pass. I waved her off, and Lucas kept humming, eyes closed, hands folded around the paper. The song pulled memories loose, the hospital hallway, the smell of antiseptic, the beeping machines. I saw Noah smiling, trying to be brave, telling me it was okay. I had promised him I would be there after the meeting, and I was not. The sound in the room grew louder, though Lucas barely raised his voice. Tears came without warning, and I did not try to stop them. They fell onto my hands and soaked into the fabric of my sleeves. Lucas finished the song with a long breath and opened his eyes. He looked at me, not afraid, not confused, just present. He asked if I was crying because the song was sad. I nodded and tried to speak and failed. Rachel sat beside me without touching and said nothing. The respect in her silence steadied me more than words could. Lucas asked if he had done something wrong. I told him no and thanked him for the song. He smiled and said he learned it from listening to people when they forgot they were teaching. That sentence stayed with me because it was exactly what he was doing to me. The storm eased slightly outside and the lights stopped flickering. Lucas yawned and leaned against Rachel, and she lifted him gently. I helped spread a blanket, and he curled into it, still holding the drawing. Before sleep took him, he asked one more thing. He asked if Noah could hear the song wherever he was. I told him I believed he could. Lucas nodded satisfied and closed his eyes. Rachel watched him breathe and then looked at me with tears finally visible. She said quietly that music reached places nothing else could. I agreed and felt the truth of it settle into my bones. When the apartment grew still again, I remained on the couch listening to the echo of the song. I understood then that the man I had been was breaking apart. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made room for something else. The song had done what arguments and money and distance never could. It had reached the man beneath the armor. I stayed there until my breathing slowed and the storm passed further away. When I finally stood, I knew something irreversible had happened. I had been broken open by a child singing a song he barely knew, and I was afraid of what would come next. The fear was quiet but persistent, like a low hum under the floorboards. I wondered if honesty would demand more than I was ready to give. Rachel cleared the mugs and moved softly, as if protecting the fragile calm. I thanked her, and she nodded without ceremony. We spoke in low voices about nothing important because that felt safest. Outside, the city sirens faded and the snow softened to a whisper. I looked at the drawing on the table and saw the lights again. They were crooked and uneven and somehow exactly right. For years, I had avoided anything that hinted at celebration. Now, a child had brought it back without asking permission. The thought both terrified and steadied me. I sat with that contradiction and did not try to solve it. In the quiet, I heard Lucas shift and sigh in his sleep. The sound felt like a promise I had not earned. I wondered what he would ask me tomorrow. I wondered what I would finally be able to answer. Sleep did not come easily, so I watched the window until the glass lightened. Morning felt close yet uncertain. I thought about the man Lucas said I seemed to be pretending to be. The idea unsettled me because it was true. I had rehearsed versions of myself for boardrooms and cameras. None of them knew how to sit with a child singing in the dark. That version of me had been missing. I did not know if I could keep him, but I knew I did not want to send him away again. The song lingered like a hand on my back, guiding me forward. I accepted that something had shifted and that I could not undo it. Whatever came next would require me to speak. That thought scared me more than the storm. I sat with the fear and stayed anyway. The man I was had cracked. The song had done its work. When I finally lay back, I held that truth carefully and waited for dawn. Somewhere in the quiet, a new question was forming. I did not know how I would answer it, but I knew I would not turn away, not after that song found me. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the apartment through the edges of the window like it was unsure it was welcome. I had not slept. I sat at the table staring at the drawing Lucas left behind, tracing the uneven lights with my eyes until they felt familiar. When Rachel came out of the bedroom, she moved quietly as if the night had left something fragile behind. She asked if I wanted coffee, and I nodded, even though my hands were already shaking. Lucas followed her, rubbing his eyes and asking if the storm had gone away. I told him it had moved on for now, and he smiled as if storms were visitors that could be trusted to leave. He climbed onto the chair and noticed my face. He asked if I was sick. I told him no and that I just needed to say something I had been holding too long. Rachel paused by the counter and waited. Lucas tilted his head and listened the way he always did. I told them the truth without arranging it into something easier. I said I had chosen work over being present. I said there was a meeting I believed could not wait. I said I missed the call. I said the road was icy. I said the hospital lights were too bright and the hallway too quiet. I said I arrived after everything had already happened. I did not dramatize it. I did not soften it. I did not say I tried my best. I said I failed. Lucas did not look away. He asked if Noah was scared. I told him he was brave. He asked if I was scared. I told him I was. Rachel sat down across from me and folded her hands. She did not interrupt. She did not rescue me from my words. I said the marriage did not survive the silence that followed. I said I learned how to keep moving without living. I said the apartment upstairs was not empty by accident. It was empty because I did not want anyone to see how little of me was left. Lucas slid the drawing toward me like it was a shield. He said sometimes when he was scared, his mom told him to draw the ending he wanted. I looked at the paper and nodded. Rachel spoke then, not to question but to acknowledge. She said thank you for telling the truth. She said not many people did that when it cost them something. Lucas asked if I was lying before. I told him yes. He asked if I would stop now. I hesitated and then said I would try. He considered that carefully and said trying counted. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folded paper. It was another drawing. 3 figures under a tree again, but this time the lights were brighter and there was a star at the top. He said, Santa did not forget me. He said Santa sent them because I needed practice. The simplicity of it broke through the heaviness, and I laughed once through tears. Rachel smiled and shook her head gently as if children had always known more than they were given credit for. I thanked Lucas for listening. He said listening was easy when people stopped pretending. The words landed deeper than anything I had said myself. I realized then that the lie I had told longest was not about what happened, but about who I was allowed to be after. I had believed the story ended with loss, and that anything after was a betrayal. Sitting there with a child who expected honesty and a woman who respected it, I saw how narrow that belief had been. Rachel asked what would happen next, and I admitted I did not know. I told her I had a foundation that mostly existed on paper and quiet checks. I told her it was meant to help families after crises, but I had kept myself distant from it. I said I wanted to do more than write funding reports. I wanted to be present. She listened without reacting and said presence mattered more than promises. Lucas finished his cereal and asked if it was Christmas morning. I told him yes. He smiled and said it felt different this year. I agreed. The city outside was waking up and the snow had softened everything into something forgiving. I stood and opened the window just enough to let the air in. It was cold and clean. Lucas came beside me and said it smelled like new paper. I told him that was a good description. Rachel gathered their things and asked how long they could stay. I told her as long as they needed and meant it without conditions. Lucas looked at me and said I looked different. I asked how. He said like someone who had stopped hiding. I did not argue. The night had taken something from me, but it had given something back too. I had stopped lying, not just to them, but to myself. That truth did not fix anything yet, but it opened a door. I did not know what waited on the other side. I only knew I was no longer pretending I could not see it. Christmas morning arrived quietly without ceremony, and for once I did not feel the urge to escape it. The apartment held a gentle stillness broken only by the soft hum of the heater and the faint sound of the city waking outside. Lucas sat at the table swinging his legs and drawing again while Rachel stood near the counter organizing their few belongings with the same care she applied to everything. I watched them both and felt the strange pull of wanting to earn a place in a moment I had not planned. Lucas finished his drawing and slid it toward me without speaking. It showed 3 figures under a tree again, but this time the lines were bolder and the lights brighter. There was snow on the ground and a star overhead drawn with extra care. He pointed to the tallest figure and said that was me. He pointed to the smaller one beside it and said that was him. Then he pointed to the third and said that was his mom. I asked where Noah was, and he thought for a moment before drawing a small star near the top of the page. He said that was where Noah could see everything. The simplicity of it caught me off guard, and my throat tightened. I thanked him and told him it was the best gift I had received in years. He nodded as if that were obvious. Rachel watched us with an expression that held both relief and caution. She asked if I was sure we were not imposing. I told her she was not, and that this was exactly where I wanted to be. She accepted that with a quiet nod. I poured coffee for all of us, and Lucas insisted on stirring the sugar himself because he said it made it sweeter. He took 1 sip and declared it perfect. The morning passed without urgency, and that felt like a miracle. At some point, Lucas looked at me seriously and asked if I was still sad. I considered the question carefully. I told him yes, but in a different way. He asked if that was okay. I said it was because sadness did not mean I was alone anymore. He seemed to think about that and then said sadness was easier when someone listened. Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand. I felt something shift again inside me this time, gentler and steadier. I told them both that I had not earned their trust or their presence and that I was grateful anyway. Rachel met my eyes and said forgiveness was not a transaction. She said it was a choice people made for themselves. Lucas nodded and added that forgiving someone did not mean forgetting, but it made carrying things lighter. I did not know where he learned that, but it landed with the weight of truth. I realized then that the forgiveness I was receiving was not for what I had done wrong that night, but for what I had done wrong long before. It was forgiveness I had never asked for and did not deserve, but it was being offered anyway. That frightened me because it meant responsibility. It meant I could no longer hide behind guilt as an excuse to stay unchanged. I told Rachel about the foundation in more detail, then about the programs I had funded from a distance and the work I had avoided because it felt too close to my own failures. I told her I wanted to change that and that I wanted to start by listening more than directing. She listened carefully and said that was a good place to begin. Lucas asked if that meant helping kids who felt forgotten. I said yes. He smiled and said that was a good job. The snow outside reflected light back into the room, and for a moment the apartment felt alive. Rachel asked what would happen after Christmas, and I told her honestly that I did not know everything, but I knew I would not disappear. I said I wanted to stay in touch and help where I could without conditions. She nodded slowly and said consistency mattered more than words. I agreed. Lucas stood and walked over to me, then wrapped his arms around my waist without asking. The gesture was sudden and unguarded, and I froze before slowly placing a hand on his back. He held on for a moment, then stepped back and said, "Thank you for listening." My vision blurred and I nodded because words felt insufficient. That was when I understood that forgiveness was not about erasing the past. It was about being trusted with the present. The forgiveness I did not deserve was being given not as absolution, but as invitation. I looked at the drawing again and then at them both and felt the weight of the invitation settle in. I knew the day would move forward and that choices would have to be made. But in that moment, all that mattered was that I was still there, and so were they. The morning was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, and for the first time in years, I did not feel the need to leave it behind. The rest of Christmas morning unfolded without miracles, and that was what made it feel real. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic promises, no music swelling at the right moment. There was only the three of us moving carefully around one another in a borrowed space, learning what it meant to share quiet without expectation. Rachel insisted on helping clean, even though there was very little to clean, and I did not argue because I understood the need to contribute to something tangible. Lucas asked if he could help too, and I gave him a cloth and watched as he wiped the table with serious dedication. He announced that he was doing an important job, and Rachel smiled and told him he always did. We ate simple food, toast, eggs, and fruit. Nothing fancy, nothing symbolic, and yet it felt heavier than any holiday meal I could remember. Lucas talked about how he used to think Christmas only worked if everything was perfect, and then said maybe it worked better when people just stayed. I did not correct him. After breakfast, Rachel gathered their things slowly and asked how long they could remain without causing trouble. I told her there was no trouble and that the building would be quiet for most of the day. She nodded but did not relax completely. I realized then that trust for her would come in layers, and I respected that. We talked about practical things next, where they would go once the storm cleared, what shelters reopened, what buses resumed. There was no drama in the conversation, just logistics and reality. I told her about the foundation again, but this time without grand language. I explained the resources that already existed and the gaps I had ignored. I said I wanted to connect her with a case manager and housing support if she wanted, and that there was no obligation. She listened carefully and asked direct questions. She asked about timelines, about expectations, about follow-through. I answered honestly, even when the answers were imperfect. Lucas sat on the floor, drawing, quietly listening without interrupting. At one point, he looked up and asked if people ever promised things and forgot. Rachel stiffened slightly, but I answered before she could. I said yes, that happened, and that it hurt when it did. I said that was why promises mattered only when they were kept. He nodded and returned to his drawing, satisfied with the answer. Rachel looked at me and said, "Consistency was the hardest thing to offer, and the most important." I agreed and felt the weight of that truth settle in. There was a moment later when the room fell silent, and the old instinct to fill it rose in me, but I resisted. I let the quiet stand because it no longer felt threatening. Lucas eventually yawned and leaned against Rachel, asking if they would leave soon. She told him they would once the roads cleared. He looked around the apartment once more and said he liked it because it felt honest. I asked him what he meant, and he said it did not pretend to be happy. That observation struck deeper than he knew. I walked them to the window, and we watched the snow slow and thin until the city began to reappear beneath it. Cars moved cautiously, and distant voices returned. Rachel thanked me again, not effusively, not emotionally, but sincerely. I told her she did not owe me gratitude, and she said she knew, but she chose to give it anyway. That distinction mattered. Lucas hugged me again quickly and said he hoped I would not forget him. I told him I would not. He asked how I could be sure, and I said because forgetting hurt too much now. He seemed satisfied with that. When it was time for them to go, I walked them to the lobby and stood beside the guard as Rachel buttoned Lucas' coat. She paused then and asked if I would really stay in touch. I told her yes and gave her my number without conditions. She took it and said actions would tell. I agreed. The doors opened and cold air rushed in, but it no longer felt hostile. Lucas waved as they stepped outside, and I watched until they disappeared into the thinning snow. I stood there alone for a long moment, resisting the urge to follow or retreat. I went back upstairs to the apartment and looked around at the signs of their presence, the moved chair, the folded blankets, the drawing on the table. Nothing had been fixed, and nothing had been erased. Yet something had shifted in a way that felt permanent. This morning had offered no miracles, only clarity. And for the first time, that felt like enough. A year passed without announcing itself, and I learned that real change rarely did. It arrived quietly through habits, choices, and moments no one applauded. The community center was already warm when I unlocked the doors that Christmas Eve, and the sound of voices spilled into the street before the first families even arrived. Folding chairs lined the walls, paper snowflakes hung unevenly from the ceiling, and a long table waited to be filled with food that volunteers would bring in waves. I stood there for a moment with my coat still on, listening to the hum of preparation, and realizing how different this felt from the silence I once chased. I was no longer hiding from nights like this. I was building space for them. When Rachel walked in holding a tray of bread, Lucas burst ahead of her, waving both arms as if the room belonged to him. He had grown taller, and his hair no longer fell into his eyes the way it once had, but his smile was the same. He ran straight toward me and stopped just short of colliding, then laughed and hugged me hard. He said I was late, and then immediately corrected himself and said it was okay because I came anyway. Rachel smiled from behind him and thanked me for opening early. I told her I always did now. They moved easily through the room as if it were familiar, because it was. Lucas joined a group of children at a table where they were writing letters to Santa, not asking for toys, but telling stories about their year. He explained to a smaller boy that Santa liked letters like that better because they were easier to carry. I watched him speak with a confidence that had not been there before, and felt something steady settle in my chest. Rachel came to stand beside me and asked how I was doing. I told her the truth. I said better, and then added that better did not mean finished. She nodded and said that was how it usually worked. The center filled gradually. Families, seniors, volunteers, people who did not know each other yet shared the same quiet hope of being seen. I moved among them listening more than speaking, learning names, remembering faces. There was no stage, no speech, no dramatic announcement, just presence. At one point, Lucas tugged on my sleeve and handed me a folded piece of paper. It was another drawing, 3 figures under a tree again, but this time the lights reached beyond the branches. He said this one was for the center, so people would know it was safe. I pinned it to the board near the entrance where everyone could see it. When the singing started later, I stood near the back and let the sound wash over me. I did not cry this time, but I felt the weight of the past loosen its grip. Rachel joined me and whispered that Noah would be proud. I did not correct her or look away. I simply nodded and let the name exist without pain. Near the end of the night, Lucas climbed onto a chair and cleared his throat dramatically, then asked for attention. He told the room that Santa sometimes came late, and that was okay because being remembered mattered more than being early. The room laughed softly, and then fell quiet in a way that felt reverent. I realized then that the promise I had kept was not about money or programs or even consistency, though those mattered. It was about staying, about choosing not to turn away when it would be easier. When the last family left and the lights were dimmed, Rachel helped stack chairs and Lucas swept the floor with exaggerated seriousness. I locked the door behind us and stepped into the cold air, feeling grounded rather than empty. Lucas looked up at the sky and said it was a good night. I agreed. Rachel asked if I would come by tomorrow to help with leftovers, and I said yes, without hesitation. She smiled and said she would see me then. As they walked away, I stood there for a moment, watching their silhouettes fade into the quiet street. I did not feel the urge to retreat or to chase. I felt present. The promise I finally kept was simple and ongoing. I would stay. Before you leave this story behind, I want to ask you to stay here with me just a little longer, not for the algorithm, not for a button, but for yourself. Because stories like this do not end when the characters walk away. They linger in the quiet spaces after the screen fades to black. Maybe you recognized something in Ethan. Maybe you recognized something in Rachel. Or maybe without realizing it, you recognized yourself. You might be someone who missed a moment you can never get back. You might be someone who stayed strong for so long that you forgot what it felt like to be seen. Or you might be someone who learned to survive by telling yourself that being alone was safer than hoping. If that is you, you are not broken. You are human. And this story was never really about Christmas or Santa or storms or empty apartments. It was about what happens when one person decides not to turn away. Sometimes we think healing arrives as a miracle, something loud and unmistakable. But more often, it arrives quietly disguised as a conversation we did not plan to have, or a stranger who asks a question we cannot ignore. Being remembered is not about being rescued. It is about being noticed. It is about someone saying, "I see you right here exactly as you are." And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that we are allowed to be seen again even after we think we have failed too much to deserve it. If this story stirred something in you, I invite you to pause and ask yourself a simple question. Who is someone you stopped checking on because life got busy because it hurt, or because you told yourself it was too late? And then ask yourself something else. What would it look like to not turn away this time? It does not have to be dramatic. It does not require fixing everything. Sometimes it is just a message, a call, or sitting with someone in silence without trying to make it better. That is how these stories begin in real life. Quietly. Imperfectly. If you are listening to this while feeling alone, I want you to know something important. You are not forgotten, even if it feels that way. Even if time has passed, even if the world moved on faster than you could. Sometimes being remembered does not look like someone knocking on your door. Sometimes it looks like finding a story that speaks directly to the part of you that thought no one noticed. This channel exists for that reason. Not to promise happy endings, but to remind you that connection is still possible, that second chances do not announce themselves, that staying matters. If you believe stories like this should keep being told, stories about ordinary people choosing kindness when it would be easier to walk away, then I invite you to stay with us. You can subscribe not as a favor to the channel, but as a way of saying these stories have a place in your life. If you feel comfortable, share this video with someone who might need it more than you do, someone who could use the reminder that they are still seen. And if you want to leave a comment, not to explain yourself, but to name someone you remember or a moment you wish you had handled differently. This space is not about judgment, it is about honesty. And if you are still here at the end of this story, that already says something about you. It says you did not turn away. And sometimes that is where everything begins.